Thank you for joining this webinar entitled Implementing the SDGs in India, Poverty, Hunger and Gender. The event is organized by the Foundation for Global Governance Sustainability, FOGS, on behalf of our UK and India partners. I'm Georgios Kostakos, the Executive Director of FOGS. This event is based on a report with the same title that was the result of a collaborative project supported by Queen Mary University of London. I will now present to you the co-authors of the report and as well as the distinguished speakers, guests that we have with us as discussants. I will present them in the order that they will take the floor. So first we will have Dr. Stella Ladhi, Senior Lecturer in Public Management, Queen Mary University of London. Then we have Dr. John Clammer, Professor, School of Liberal Arts and Humanities at the OP Jindal Global University. Welcome to both of you. Ms. Sudha Reddy, Secretary and Director of the Eco Foundation for Sustainable Alternatives, EFSA. And this is the group of the co-authors of the report. We wish we had with us also the other key co-author, Dr. Neetu Sharma, Coordinator and Program Head of the Right to Food Center for Child and the Law, National Law School University in India. Unfortunately, because of the situation in India and her family situation with regard to the pandemic, she could not be with us. And we wish her the best quick recovery of her relatives who are suffering. And then we're very privileged to have also 4 distinguished discussants with us. Mr. Nikhil Seth, United Nations Assistant Secretary General, Executive Director of the UN Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR. If he could switch on his camera, though you can see him. Thank you very much for being with us, Mr. Seth. Dr. Tara MS, she is the SDG 2 Action Committee member from the government of Karnataka. Thank you very much, Dr. Tara. Thank you. We have also Dr. Rajesh Tandon, Founder President of the Society for Participatory Research in Asia, PRIA, and Dean of the PRIA International Academy. Dr. Tandon, thank you very much for being with us. And last but not least, Ms. Faye Leone, Senior Policy Advisor at the Tracking Progress Program of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD. Thank you very much, Ms. Leone, for being with us. So we will start now with the presentation of the report. First of all, some welcoming remarks from Dr. Stella Ladhi, who represents also Queen Mary University of London. As I said before, they supported the project, and of course, Ms. Ladhi also is a co-author, a substantive participant in this project. Dr. Ladhi.
Thank you very much, Georgios, for organizing the event and for giving me the floor. I want to thank all the participants, our co-authors that Georgios mentioned, but also the discussants and the attendees of this seminar. Our thoughts are with Neetu, and we really hope that everything goes well for her. She was the one that visited us in London when we started working on the project. So it's a pity she's not with us, but it's not important since we will have other opportunities to work together. Our thoughts are with her and her family. The project was a small project funded by Queen Mary University of London under the Global Challenge Research Fund that we have. It's a global engagement research initiation scheme. So the idea is that this report and this cooperation that we will be presenting to you today is only the first step for further collaboration. We worked on three specific sustainable development goals, and this was after discussion with our Indian partners and their own interests. So it's about poverty, hunger, and gender. And very, very soon, John will present to you some of the findings and the discussions that we had. Just to say that this is a very difficult moment for the globe, but for India also. And it's very possible that what we find in the report is already changing. And what we know already from the report and from the work that we've done is that indicators alone cannot explain how much has been implemented or what exactly the gaps are. And this is going to be even more difficult now that we'll be trying to count the wounds of this pandemic in these specific sustainable development goals, but also more broadly. I don't want to take any more time. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. And I pass the floor back to Georgios. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stella. And again, thanks very much to the Queen Mary University of London for their support. Now we will have Dr. John Clammer, who will present the report, the key points of the report, and he has a PowerPoint presentation also. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgios. Again, may I add my voice to welcoming all of you. And sadly, this presentation should really have been done by Niju Sharma, but as we've heard, she's not available tonight. So I will be doing it on behalf of the authors of the report. As the report is available to you entirely free of charge, of course, on the FOG's website. Printed copies will, we hope, very, very quickly be available as well. So since I think only probably the discussants have had a chance to read the report up to now, I'd like to just spend a few minutes trying to explain what we achieved, what we tried to achieve, and what this whole research project was about. You see the title in front of you, but can we have the first slide, the first substantive slide? Thank you. Our goal was not to critique the way in which the SDGs have been implemented or not in India, as may be the case, but really to examine effective pathways of indeed setting about their implementation and looking at the ways in which, in some cases, although the aspirations to do this are there, they've been blocked in various ways. And for that reason, why we spend quite a lot of the report looking, in fact, at what we've called here the methodologies, the various methodologies in which data about the SDGs is being collected, presented, and analyzed by the central government, by states, and by other interested agencies. Because we felt very much that one of the key questions in examining this whole question was indeed what is reported, how effective that data is, and what policy decisions can be made or not made on the basis of the kind of data available to us. Now, as you know, we chose 3 of the SDGs, 1, 2, and 5, poverty, hunger, and gender. Well, why these 3? Partly because the whole project was, of course, simply not big enough for us to examine the entire range of SDGs across the whole of Indian society. And the implementation varies considerably. Some states, for example, have not picked particular NGOs for any emphasis at all. We thought these were the 3 critical ones, partly because they are so major in their impact on society and the essential questions of addressing these if sustainability is to be achieved, and partly because we felt they're closely related to one another. They're not only related to one another, but we felt they were foundational to the implementation of the other SDGs without attention paid to poverty, hunger, and gender. Others are likely to remain as very aspirational and not really be able to be carried into practice. We know, of course, that although the Indian government is, of course, a signatory to the idea of applying the SDGs to Indian society, compliance is voluntary, but we know, I think, that the SDGs have become, in fact, essentially international obligations, and substantial embarrassment, I think, attaches to any government which finds that it's not reporting or not reporting adequate progress. So there is that kind of international pressure, to show progress on the achievement or all or some of the SDGs and all of their various subsections. These are guidelines, of course. The SDGs are guidelines. They're not a legal framework which states have to follow. And success in achieving them depends on individual countries' own sustainability policies and plans and the energy with which they approach this. And for that reason, of course, to look at one case study, a huge case study, of course, in the case of India, And we think we're able to track some of those questions. What are the factors that contribute to success in achieving them? Could we have the next slide? Thank you. Now, we took India as a case study, partly because three of us who are actually carrying out a great deal of the actual progress are in India, in Bangalore and in Delhi, my own case. As I've just mentioned, we felt that poverty, hunger, and gender are foundational to all of the other SDGs. This we thought was particularly true in the Indian case. I'm sure it's true anywhere to some extent, right? Even before the impact of COVID-19, the long-term effects of which are going to take a very long time to work through the system. India ranked 129 on the HDI, on the Human Development Index, and 102nd out of 117 countries which are listed on the Global Hunger Index. So clearly, despite its enormous achievements in other respects, that the sheer size of the Indian economy is very large, okay? The country has not done terribly well when it comes to raising its ranking on these kind of international indicators. We had therefore two key questions. One way was to look indeed at effective pathways for implementing the SDGs in India. What's been done? Has it been done effectively? Or if we see blockages, then where are those blockages, with the hope that once identified, they can be removed and the implementation, of course, made much more effective and progressive. We also, as I mentioned before, wanted to take very long critical look at the methodologies and tools, reporting methods, the nature of official data, with which information about the SDGs is reported across India. And I'll mention something very briefly about that in a moment. We felt this was critical because without that kind of accurate data, of course, you have no baseline for which to measure progress. We also wanted to look at practices, not only reporting methods and data, what individual states were doing in terms of attempting to implement the SDGs, what awareness training they were providing for their government officers and other stakeholders in attempting to move towards a much more effective implementation of the SDGs. Next slide, please. In doing this, we looked at a number of things which are all reported in, of course, much more detail in the report itself. One was the role of the center in India. And this is complicated because the center has a rather ambiguous relationship to the application of the SDGs, including who is actually responsible for this. And the principal agency for this is Niti Aayog, but other roles and responsibilities, collection of data and so on, distributed across a whole range of agencies, which means there is really no centralization, no key centralization of effective strategy. The second was that when we looked across the range of states and union territories in India, we found that the level of preparedness and action varied very considerably across the country, varying from states which have done actively worked on identifying and finding strategies to implement the SDGs across to ones that were doing actually very little, although almost always, the idea that they were committed to the fulfillment of the SDGs is part of their constitutions, their self-promotion, as it were. Though in fact, those levels of preparedness and action we found vary very, very considerably. This is partly because of the very complex mix of structures, training and awareness, and indeed publicization of the SDGs across different states. What we meant by that was when we looked at the empirical data, we found that, for example, in some states, the state government is actively involved in implementation of the SDGs, in others it's not. In some cases, there are specific agencies tasked with this, in others they are not. There is no really coherent application of the idea of spreading awareness of the SDGs. In many cases, government officers were not trained, or if they were sensitized at all to the existence, indeed, of the SDGs. This was done on a very, very limited basis, a day, a weekend, the occasional workshop, something like this. but without there being systematic responsibility for this concentrated in, say, a particular ministry within a state. And this seemed to me to be something of a problem. We found too a general unwillingness to draw on the expertise of NGOs and university researchers. Now, as you know, India is rich in NGOs, and many of those NGOs, of course, have extensive grassroots experience of what is actually happening and have data, therefore, which arises not from large-scale statistical surveys necessarily, but from their actual experiential interaction with people on the ground. That evidence, it seemed to us, plus the evidence that's being generated by university researchers is profoundly important and largely ignored in state-led, whether at the center or at the level of individual states, in the implementation of the SDGs. Furthermore, that variety is reflected in very different reporting methodologies and tracking tools. In other words, in some states, goals were identified in certain ways. Evidence of movement towards those goals was tracked in different ways from in other states, which means basically that looking across India as a whole, it's very hard to find a unified picture of the nature of either the data or the methodologies that are being used. So it's very hard to find a really coherent picture. Assuming that's important, you may want to argue that it's not, and to some extent, individual states should indeed be left to define the way they want to do it, given their own local cultural, linguistic, historical traditions. We found a lot of aspirational thinking. That's to say, people were very kind of, supportive of the idea, thought this was a wonderful idea, without necessarily translating those aspirations into very much in the way of practice. Next slide, please. Just 2 to go. Since the advent of COVID-19 and its current epidemic proportions in India, of course, we're expecting that there will be huge impact of this on the implementation of the SDGs. It may set things back. It may, in fact, stimulate the pursuit of some of these key SDGs because their significance in the sustainability of society has now become so extremely important. So amongst the structural issues that we wanted to point to, hopefully in a post-COVID-19 world, were the things you see on the screen. The National Indicator Framework gives a certain unified idea of measuring data of social and economic progress in India, but that there are still outstanding methodological and contextual issues which need to be addressed if a unified model can be created. There are huge data gaps, and as we suggested, this varies so much from state to state that it is sometimes extremely difficult to draw up any kind of unified picture. We found a failure in many cases to link the SDGs to one another. In other words, they're considered as kind of separate things without the kind of energy which is developed out of, in fact, the synergy when you begin to put them together, not only the way in which they link to one another in very objective terms, hunger, poverty, for example, hunger, poverty in then relation to gender, but as a systematic problem across the other SDGs, which we've not examined in this particular report. What we thought of or called ambiguous decentralization, and I think we see an example of that happening right now in India. The center is pushing certain responsibilities for COVID response to the states, leaving them with certain responsibilities. It's not clear exactly who is really responsible for implementation of policy, for the distribution of resources and so on. And that seems to be a rather systemic problem. And it certainly appears in our analysis of the SDGs, sorry. Statistics, in some cases, substituted for actual on-the-ground awareness of realities. What we meant by that is essentially, of course, statistics will give you the broad structural picture, but they don't necessarily tell you what is actually happening on the ground, how this is related to issues of caste, urbanization, displacement of workers because of whether lockdowns or other social processes. And we felt there was very much the need to link the statistical data to that much more ethnographic and rooted grassroots analysis of the way in which the SDGs are working, are known about, are appearing in one form or another in villages, towns, whatever context across the country. Then the final slide, please. This points us finally in the document to a number of key issues. And here they are, and I'm sure some of our commentators will have much more to say about this. Number one, the lack of training and sensitization of government officers. In some cases, they seem to know very little. They've probably heard the word or the term SDGs and have no real training about what this means and how they might be responsible for carrying those SDGs into practice, converting them into actual policy within their state or agency. As we've noted several times, there's severe problems with data and data collection methodologies and the comparison, the difficulty of comparing data across states and agencies. Lack of clear guidance from the center, though, as I say, that is a little ambiguous. Some people might argue, indeed, that the states are the place where implementation will be, of course, on the ground carried out. But a division of policy, and when there's this policy unclarity, I think that is a retrogressive state and makes even the states, the work of the states difficult because they do not know, in fact, what the center wants from them. We think that the collaboration of civil society organizations, including NGOs, universities, indeed business sector, since many companies have corporate social responsibility programs, some of which indeed are devoted to implementing or in some way contributing to the fulfillment of the SDGs. And finally, the need to finally expand capabilities across the whole range of things, particularly those government agencies and officers that are actually responsible for ultimately applying policy without their training to the level at which they really understand what is asked of them, and how they might indeed carry out those policies in practice, since they're not necessarily trained in social sciences or in anthropology or sociology or whatever would be the appropriate field. The need to expand those capabilities is critical, because without it, I think a lot of the ideas about SDGs across India will remain aspirational, simply because there's not the people power to carry them into practice. So with that last thought, I will conclude. Thank you, Giorgio.
Thank you very much, John. I think you gave a very good overview of the main points of the report. And I have also given in the chat the link to the report itself for anybody who wants to read it directly. And we are preparing a Kannada translation in the language of Karnataka. And we had hoped to have in other languages too, so as many people as possible can read it. Next speaker is Ms. Sudha Reddy, who has been part of the core report writing team, and she has also been an inspiration herself, been both theoretically involved in this, but also practically with people on the ground in the villages, etc. Please, your perspective. Yeah.
Thank you, Georgios. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. John, for all overview. I don't think there is much to cover from my side. And it's almost, it's there and it's in the, also we could discuss later. And I really look forward to the panelists for their suggestions and comments. But just meanwhile, I just want to put it, it's my experience while working in the field also. That's why it's very important, we mentioned it is what is the ground reality when we look at the statistical data. So they're coming very, one thing puzzled me about looking at the gender, the, SDG 5, when it says that, gender equality, and then it talks about the women and children, girls. I was just wondering, where is the space for, when you talk about gender, especially, this is under, where is the space for LGBTQ communities? That is something which, I felt it is strongly missing. So that is how, that's one point I highlighted, we highlighted actually in our recommendations too. So that's something whether we really relook into to this whole, the SDG framework when it comes to the gender part of it. That is something which puzzled me. Of course, now the big challenge is after this COVID is there. So let's continue and let's listen to our panelists, their suggestions, and we're happy to integrate your suggestions and comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sudha. And we will have opportunities, of course, to continue the discussion afterwards once we've heard from our discussants also. And I would like our discussants to speak for about like 7 minutes each, so that we have time also for another round and then to take questions also from the participants. We have started getting some of them already from the attendees. So first, I would like to ask Mr. Nikhil Seth. He's from the United Nations. He's now the Executive Director of UNITAR, but before, in his other previous incarnations as senior UN official, he was very close to the beginning of the SDGs, right, as the head of the Secretariat of the Rio Plus 20 conference, and then with the negotiations leading to the adoption of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs as part of it in 2015. So he can tell us from the idea, the negotiations, and the practice, how he sees all these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Georgios. And let me start with a word of appreciation to FOGS, and you personally, Georgios, to the contributors of the report under discussion, and to today's excellent panelists and organizers. Thank you all. I would also like to preface my comments by saying that no report on India, with all its complexities and dualities, can be received without criticism. So take what I am going to say with a pinch of salt. Of course, when we created the SDGs, we treated them as an indivisible whole of 17 goals and 169 targets, which cover economic, social, environmental issues, as well as the creation of peaceful and just societies. Now, what has been done here is to extract 3 of the SDGs, which is in a sense partial. John has explained the reasons why, and I appreciate that. But this is an interdependent and indivisible matrix, the SDGs, and illuminating only a part of them does a kind of injustice to illuminating the entire pie. So I do start with this mild criticism. And if you look at contemporary India, and especially in light of this terrible second wave of coronavirus, I would have said that to poverty, hunger, and gender, I would like to add health and education, also to separate SDGs. Health, we know the reasons why. We've been totally unequipped in India to handle this. And putting that into perspective would be very, very important. But this is contemporary, so the formulation and the strategizing on the report would probably have predated the actual second wave and all that. Plus ignorance, the response and the sort of reactions to the second wave has revealed the ignorance, the prevalent in large parts of my country. And it would have been great if education and this learning at all times would also have been included. But this is only a personal thing. So my point is, first, if you had to extract from a subset of the 17 interdependent SDGs, you should have included health, because public health today has become the major concern, and education, and everything flowing from education, which would make tasks in India so much more easier. I want to also focus on the future and the types of things we need to do in India. But before I do that, let me comment on specific aspects of the report, which have been so well introduced by John and by Sudha. I just wanted to say, first I'll focus really on the key concerns, the analysis and recommendations contained in the report, and which are being discussed today. First is on the issue of gaps in data for the SDGs. As we all know, that collection of data in India is not primarily geared towards the SDGs, but also satisfied a host of other public policy needs. It is quite sophisticated. I know our data system in India, it is rooted in history, it has a long tradition, And it has these traditions have a momentum of their own, and changing them is not easy. Whether it's census data, for which we have a long history, or administrative data, which we don't use enough in India, which we should, there is a great potential, and I agree with the authors, to streamline and modernize the methodology and the nature of data collected. SDGs focus on interconnections, and the data we have is siloed in India. What we need is dynamic system modeling. As you said, how do you build on the relationship between gender and poverty, gender and health, gender and other aspects of the SDGs in education? Because it's only understanding the dynamics between these SDGs which will result in policy shifts. So we want policymakers to shift their focus on many of these things. And that will only happen if we have dynamic system modeling. And for dynamic system modeling, you need different kinds of data. You can't continue to rely on historical and administrative and census data the way which we've been using in India. So that's a point well made in the report. And I think these policy shifts which we need, policy shifts must lead to budgetary shifts, because budget is where a state's intention is reflected. How are we changing the fact that we have only 1.4% of our budget devoted to health? We've got to change it in the future. This is not acceptable anymore. So I'm in agreement with the observations of the report, and I feel the need that the report needs to go a little further in understanding this dynamic systems analysis, and what is the kind of data at all levels. It's not only at the central level, but also at the state, the municipality, the community, every place where policy has to be made as to how do we change the type of data we collect. Second, on the problem of coping with decentralization, we are a big country, and the decentralization experiment has been going on for decades. And I agree that greater clarity has to be made in giving states greater ownership. SDGs belong to everyone, really. And when we were developing this, we never intended the SDGs to be a straitjacket. It is not something which we impose on countries, regions, and lower levels and formations of government, whether it's state level, community level, or village level. We want ownership first, and the SDGs belong to everyone. And the states in particular should have much greater flexibility in localizing and prioritizing state level priorities among the SDGs. If you look at the Indian map, the priorities of each state are very, very different. And I feel that this decentralization and encouraging ownership at lower levels of government is very important. And I think we should go down to the district level and to the municipality levels in many cases. So I appreciate those comments made on decentralization and re-rationalizing the kind of center-state relations we have. And I appreciate the observations in the report on the nature of federalism in India and the often neglect of the social context, which has been pointed out quite accurately. I compliment the writers on their high-value analysis and their recommendations. So let me now, in the end, turn to and put on my hat as a UN staff member who was crucially involved in the development of the SDGs, which was an amazing inclusive process. And the type of people who participated was not only governments, academia, civil society, business participated very enthusiastically in a very long but very inclusive process. What is our priority in the UN today? And I think it's very relevant to India today. And we keep using this expression, building back to better. But what does building back better mean in practical terms? I think there are 4 legs on which building back better stands. The first leg, in light of what's happening around us in COVID-19 and the threat of infectious diseases, first is universal health care, especially for the prevention, treatment, and cure of infectious diseases, and an effective public health system. This is part of the SDGs, but I think we need to take it out of the SDGs and give it a much higher priority. The second leg of the Building Back Better is putting the SDGs back on track and making this the responsibility of each level of government, of academia, of business and civil society and beyond. In making the ownership of the SDGs belong to each citizen. It is not something abstract which belongs to somebody else. It actually belongs to each one of us. And we can see how in our lives we can internalize contributing to the SDGs. So I think that's a very important part on which much greater effort needs to be taken. Third is on climate change action. Now, while again, goal 13 is a climate change goal, but we, while negotiating, always realize that the climate agenda runs on a parallel track, and Paris and subsequent now COP26 is coming up in Glasgow. All those should be humanized. It is not about carbon alone. It's about poverty and hunger and water and the transitions the world needs to make. And India needs to make all these transitions. Transitions in energy, transitions in water use, transitions in agriculture. And goal 2 is not only about hunger. It's about sustainable agriculture, actually, which covers many of these actions relating to climate change. And finally, I would say filling the financial and technology gap and using digital technologies to build back better. India, we have a lot of talent in this area, but how will that talent permeate into policy and decision-making and applications? That's the challenge we face. So these are the areas in which my country needs to engage with renewed enthusiasm if we really want to reach the goals and we want to build back a better India. Thank you, judges.
Thank you very much, Nikhil. And we take, of course, the criticism, the constructive criticism for the report. As an co-author of the report, I have to say, we would have liked to be able to expand to cover more SDGs, but we had limited resources and time, and of course the pandemic threw us off. So we decided to share it anyway, the initial results, and we have a lot to learn ourselves and hopefully to continue and cover, as you said, all the aspects. And it is, I also keep that it is everybody's business, each individual to really succeed, for the SDGs to succeed as a model for a future sustainable for all. So, but we'll discuss more. Thank you very much. Dr. Tara is our next speaker, and she has a long, illustrious career in the field of public nutrition, health, and child development. She has been closely associated with many state government and corporate bodies, as well as NGOs and international organizations like UNICEF, the World Bank, and Care India. So we're very happy to have her with us. Dr. Tara also has a presentation that she asked us to project at the same time. Dr. Tara, you have the floor. I don't know if she can hear us.
Okay, thank you.
Yes,
can you
good.
hear me? Yeah, thank you. I think half my job is done by the previous speaker. Nikhil has already given most of the information that we wanted to give. I'm thankful to him for sharing, lessening our burden. However, this some of the findings that I have observed and the recommendation, it's basically based on Karnataka's experience, and specifically, even if I have to say SDG 2, again, focusing more on goal 2.2, which is related to child development. So I think it's going to be exclusively on that, and not on the entire on all aspects. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, just about the report, I wanted to say it's a very well written report which raises some of the fundamental issues which has already been spelled out by the earlier speaker. But most importantly, I feel that it is well timed. Appropriate timing of the study is such a useful thing, because an early appraisal on such an initiative is a huge gain for many stakeholders. Because SDG, if we have to really do something, it's everybody's job, as everybody has got responsibility. So many stakeholders have a role, I think, enabling us to understand few issues at this point in time, when we've just started. I think it's a value, such a big value for, those of us who are interested in doing something to the country. And then as regards the status which has been brought out, especially targets pertaining to parameters of malnutrition are way behind. I fully agree, as the report says, because reports in delivery mechanisms due to COVID pandemic, and also it's surely a crisis that needs easing. But what I am suggesting is that in the report, if had there been a possibility of giving some kind of a template kind of a thing to look into these issues as a suggestion, for improving the nutritional status, I think that would have helped tremendously, or some pointers to kind of for the states to take up. Then, although of course we do have certain things given by Government of India, then UNICEF has given us some guidelines, all those things are there. But however, in the context of SDGs, had there been some communication from the center to the state, I think that would be better. And for that to be done, I think a study like this should come out with some evidences to prove that yes, this can be workable. That's one thing. Then point raised in SDG planning and implementation methodology, of course, it's a very, very valid point. And I feel that it needs more introspection from the point of view of many things which has already been discussed. And then because each state is different. And if you look at India, per se, be it its population or diversity in terms of many things, it's a huge task. So, having some, being such a heterogeneous kind of a thing, whether it's a society or, our governance issues, there are so many challenges that needs to be looked into. So I think in a way, to kind of contextualizing it, it becomes much more easier. But however, that contextualization, according to the report, has fallen short in taking, cognizance of the country-specific situation, it says. But some specific example could have been given. I partly feel that some of the things that we have raised, as indicators, or let's say, I think it's based on the country-specific, scenario. Or even, for example, if I have to talk from Karnataka, we have basically taken, although let's say, for example, from the center, from the, we did receive some kind of a guideline, but we contextualized it in Karnataka based on our own understanding of the, the regions in Karnataka, because our northern Karnataka is different, southern Karnataka is different. So looking at those issues, we had to, kind of come up with, some kind of a, target, because I do understand, coming up with a base value in itself was a huge task, particularly when databases were inadequate. So, but, if specific examples had been given, it would have made some sense. Maybe even there's a lot of scope for, corrections and improvement or additions. This is from the perspective of the study that I said. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now the approach to, what we are saying is states initiative. When we say state initiatives needs capturing, which I feel, because I'm talking from the point of Karnataka, because in this particular report, Karnataka has been taken as a example. So therefore, I'm coming up with this, but not as a person from the government or anything, but as a researcher, I find it's more interesting to kind of give a proper perspective. In that sense, say, institutional mechanism, itself is something that requires a lot of thinking and lot of, effort to, take it forward. So now, for example, in Karnataka, what we have, they've done, state has formed a specific goal committee for each of the goal. I think many states have done this, and which is chaired by the very senior IAS officer, and formed a monitoring and coordinating committee at the state and steering level committee for smooth functioning. And implementation and monitoring of SDGs till 2030, okay, they have taken a decision to kind of, bringing them all together. Then creation of SDG coordination center. I think that itself is an initiative state has taken, because it is not that the same, existing staff were given additional work to kind of look into this SDG matter. So the coordination center looks into a lot of things, which be it monitoring or, be it, many aspects of the SDGs are being done by this dedicated center. Okay, then again, NITI Aayog 62 priority indicators are being reviewed every month. And actually, I would like to say that, if you look at some of the indicators, or the targets rather, it's targets rather. So actually, we've already, these have been, we've been discussing this or been, looking at it from our developmental programs. It's not that it is something new, it's already there. But what has happened is that, with the SDG in plate, actually, the state is discussing each of these priority indicators, because I'm calling it 62 priority indicators, which the center has given, but the state, in addition to that, have identified a few more, which which are more like sub indicators to enable the priority indicators to come up with some kind of a good action. So Karnataka Development Program, KDP we call it, every month the review is done. So although the review of the state at the district and level has been carried out regularly on these indicators. So monitoring is there, but again, there are a lot of improvements that requires, I'm saying, that needs to be, that cannot be overlooked. Then capacity building and training, I do agree that it is something weak in terms of SDGs, perspective. It has not been adequately addressed to, although there has been some kind of an orientation and, enabling the key people to have an understanding on this. But the state has also come up with a lot of IEC materials to create awareness, particularly publicity among children, youth especially, and stakeholders, and also bringing in some kind of an issue with the community radio. So these are a few state initiatives that are already there. But creating dashboards or something that it's not for the state alone, but enabling the districts to understand. So that these have been created to make them sensitive, and then to take action on on those areas where it is performing low. Then leveraging technology, that has been the major, I would say, initiative in Karnataka, because as Nikhil already said, that the rudiment, the earlier way of collecting data and looking at certain sources, I think we need to little more modernize. So now, for enabling these, accelerating these processes, the technology has been adequately tapped, and for particularly for data sourcing and other things, which I'll tell you later. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So, but I'll not, okay, just one, go back. See, I'll just take 1 minute of time. No, just go back. Process followed for developing action plan. Why I'm mentioning this is, the report actually says that, contextualization, I'd like to kind of bring in an emphasis, not that I'm critical about it, but, just to say that, what kind of process that was followed. This is just an example for one goal that we did. We had series of activities, constituting, goal committee with the designated chairperson, with all the sectors representing. And then along with that, we had academicians, we had, like activists, we had from the, civil society organization, all of them put together formed a kind of a group. Then we had several meetings, and we looked into the databases available. We looked into the indicators. We wanted to see the status vis-a-vis, what we have or what we don't have. So gap analysis was made. And based on all that, we came up with an action plan. And that action plan is exclusively for, see, this is an action plan, which is, I don't think it has been, it is not circulated as yet. So what has been captured from the the comprehensive report is what is coming in this research study, but each committee or each goal has come up with an exclusive report, which is based on, which is actually on action plan, and how the state, how the sectors have to actually implement those in order to able to achieve that. So this is the process that was followed. Next, please. Next slide, please. So particularly talk about eradicate. No, go back, please go back. Eradication of malnutrition. Okay, this is what was the basis for plan of action? Especially for priority indicators. I'm telling you, all this while we did have a lot of problem on the data, and therefore whether it is for allocation of funds or whether it is for monitoring, whether it is for any other purpose for that matter, was difficult, or to bring in some kind of an evidence, or to say innovation for that matter. We didn't have adequate databases. But because of this, these, for priority indicators, the source of data that was taken, especially for this, is we have got exclusively for, hunger index for Karnataka, which is district based. Each district we have come up with ranking, then constituency based undernutrition, because this is exactly what we wanted to do, because we wanted electoral political representatives, elected representatives should know what their situation is in their constituency, to be able to contribute and to be able to help improve the situation. Then district wise that we have, constituency wise we have, and both in terms of ranking and also especially for prevalence of anemia and BMI of women by district and ranking, status and targets and sub-indicators for each districts we have, district-wise target with timeline we have brought out with which are the districts which are online, which needs to accelerate further from what time to what time. This was the biggest exercise that we have done, to be able to identify which district is at what category and how it should move forward. So, and especially in Karnataka, we have a huge problem because drought declared talukas and districts are, we have about 129 talukas which has got a drought. And then although there has been special allocations, there has been special action that has been taken, even within one district, we see some Gram Panchayat have zero problem. It's not, some are totally hit by drought and some have no problems at all. So actually what is happening such being the heterogeneous in terms of, let's say, even at a unit level, at the lowest unit level, yes, monitoring becomes difficult. But what I'm trying to say is, today we have a way to go to that last mile. That is something because of SDG role. Next, please. Next slide. Next. So capacity building and training, of course, it is very weak, as everybody has said, which has come in the report also. But if I have to talk about Karnataka's this thing, which could have been taken in the report is, there is already a sensitization drive, across the thing, all sectors, of course, because of COVID-19, it has stalled, which some of the programs are online. Otherwise, Administrative Training Institute in Mysore has been identified as a nodal training body for enabling the nodal officers to get trained. And then also, state, and also, it has planned for the entire this thing to train all the stakeholders for all the, especially for 5 to 6 goals. So, and then also, if I have to talk about nutrition related thing or malnutrition related or say the nutrition specific issues, CFTRI from Mysore has been collaborated with ATI Mysore in terms of capacity building on what kind of in terms of, what kind of food technology could be adopted, used for enabling, better, improvement in the situation. Next slide, please. Next slide. I've got 2 more slides, which I'll finish. So expanding capabilities, which are already is mentioned. I think, leveraging technology is something that has come in a survey, and I think this is a little difficult. So, the Avalokana is a software that has been developed, which,
Dr. Tara, you're breaking up.
enables in, bringing transparency, basically e-governance tool that enables the government to access data on exprams. The software provides a focus eye view on SDGs, especially on scheduled caste, subplan.
I'm sorry for this technical problem.
Tribal subplans and centrally sponsored schemes, because the report categories or certain categories of this thing reach because of this. So, but since now we understanding as what has been done or what needs to be done. Okay. Similarly, we have another.
We don't seem to have a good connection with Dr. Tara. I think We have
software which is called Akansha, which is an integrated online platform for a lot, capturing this and partnership with CSR and the society organization to get part with this. So linked to that, and technology is being adequately tapped to use this. So I think with this, I'll
Thank you. I think we have to finish here. It was a very
thing, but I do have time in such a time that I would say, yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tara. We had some problems towards the end of your presentation, but I think it's very clear that a lot is happening, and we are very happy to see that whether you saw the report or not, I mean, and the agencies there is a response to it and all the issues that they have been identified, a lot of them, and it seems to be in a good direction. We'll talk more in the discussion afterwards.
Yeah.
Thank you very much again.
Yeah.
We can go now to Dr. Rajesh Tandon, who has a lot of experience, and he's an internationally acclaimed leader and practitioner of participatory research and development. His methodology is advanced through PRIA that evaluates experiential knowledge and practitioners' wisdom in addition to the more formal knowledge available in academia and books. And his work has been recognized and supported by the fact that he has been appointed in 2012 as UNESCO co-chair on community-based research and social responsibility in higher education. So from all this experience and from your perspective, we look forward to hearing your views.
Thank you very much, Georges. You can hear me?
Very well, thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the report. I had an occasion to glance through it, but thank you, Professor John, for Clammer, for sharing the highlights of it, and of course the comments made by the other discussants. Let me say that the report about implementation of 3 SDGs, without going into those 3 SDGs, but let's say the report about the very process of implementation of SDGs in India, is actually give me no surprise. It is actually capturing what has been happening in this country for the last 40 years, as long as I am active. So let me illustrate what I mean. In 2001, 20 years ago, India was 130 on HDI index ranking. In 2020, it is 129. In this period of 20 years, our GDP has gone up from less than $1 trillion to nearly $3 trillion. It has gone up more than 3 times, but our rank on HDI remains the same. The question for each one of us, including those who are responsible for governance of this country, is why? Now, let me illustrate why. The foundation of planning in this country has been completely topsy-turvy. You mentioned in the report that Niti Aayog is responsible for SDGs. It is. But the entity, there is only one entity in this country which has a constitutional legitimacy for planning, socio-economic development, and it is called District Planning Committee. Neither Niti Aayog nor state planning boards exist in India's constitution. Only DPC exists. But as the report shows, perhaps DPC was not even involved in SDG planning, because in many states, DPCs are defunct or captured by political elites. Niti Aayog at the national level, therefore, is helpless because of the contextual diversity and local priorities that exist. So the appropriate unit for planning is actually DPC, the District Planning Committee. Dr. Tara was giving some example from Karnataka about district variations, and even in some situations below district. Now, this is not a malaise only for SDGs. This is a universal malaise in this country. Second malaise that the report points out, that training of government functionaries was not adequate. Awareness, training, etc., etc. Not new. I used to serve on many advisory committees of the Planning Commission, erstwhile Planning Commission, till 2014. And even in the late 1990s and early 2000, Planning Commission used to review national development programs. It used to have an independent role in monitoring and evaluation of national development programs. And each of its report, whether it was IRDP in those days or it was Women and Child Development or whatever program it was, in the lacuna of the program, it used to say the capacity and orientation and awareness of functionaries was not adequately built. This is a malaise from 1980s, not new. And this is in a country where we have nearly 400 government training institutes for government functionaries. Dr. Tara was giving example from Karnataka, but starting from the most premier in Mussoorie Academy down to the Panchayat training centers and VLWs and farmers, we have nearly 400 of them. And yet training and capacity building continues to be a weakness. Why? Because training and capacity building institutions, posting by government officials there continues to be considered as a punishment posting. You don't want an officer in the line ministry, you push that officer into head of the training institution. The purpose of training is not learning. The purpose of training is to fulfill just the checklist. And you will be shocked to know that in between 2006 and 2011, my organization with some 400 other organizations conducted training of RTI, Right to Information Act, training of government functionaries designated as information officers who did not know what acts they were supposed to implement. So I don't need to tell you any more than this. And the last point I want to make is that we can take the first 5 SDGs as foundational, though I in some respect consider the 1, 2, and 5 which have been taken as critical. Health is important, but what is the status of women in this country? That on gender index also, we have not moved very far. Though literacy rates have increased, women's participation in education has gone up, we have the largest number of professionally trained and qualified housewives in the world. They become PhDs and sit at home. So there is a patriarchal system which continues to exclude. But the problem is that in 1, 2, and 5, we have to look at those who are at the bottom of the economic ladder. And our organization with several others have been doing quite a bit of work with informal women workers. First of all, 94% of India's workforce is in the informal, unorganized, very precarious, vulnerable job situation. Secondly, if you look at women domestic workers, we call them maids occasionally, they do not even get considered under labor laws as workers. Domestic workers are not included. Their livelihood, in the last 14 months, we have been working with them, trying to feed their families, support them somehow. Their livelihood is most precarious because the middle class, upper middle class employers throw them out for fear of pandemic. They have nowhere to go. And last year, when nearly 50 million migrant labor were walking on foot around this time last year, in May and June, when Supreme Court asked Indian government, what data you have, the Commissioner of Labor came to Supreme Court and said, sorry, sir, we have no information on migrant labor. And following that, a committee was set up, some civil society organization put some pressure. Now recently some exercise in informal migrant labor data collection has begun. So the problem of data is not new and will continue to bog us down. I think whether it is MDGs at the turn of the millennium or it is SDGs now or whatever else, the problem is not individual actors or individual capacities. The problem is the system of governance which has been put in place is a problem. Recently last week, I wrote a blog about how we have more than 2 million elected representatives in this country, if you include panchayats and municipalities. But in the disaster management situation like the pandemic, very few of them have any role. It's being driven by bureaucracy, Ministry of Home Affairs, and the cops are running around on the street trying to catch people. But where are the elected representatives? Where are our local governance institutions? It was in 1992 December that the parliament passed, and in 93 April that the president gave assent to the world's most significant decentralization and devolution acts known as 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment. And even the shining state of Karnataka in the 90s had a much better devolution than it has now. Dr. Tara will remember that. So the fundamental problem of governance is at the heart of all this. And I am very happy that the report points its fingers to it. There is no need to debate whether gender index is better or poverty index is worse, but these are interrelated questions. So we need to fix and we need to start governance from below, and we have the institutional mechanisms to make it possible. The district planning committee exists in each district. It is a constitutional body. It should be activated, it should be constituted, it should be resourced, and it should be built to function. So I think the report does a wonderful job of pointing out what are some of the structural conditions that need to change if we have to implement any SDG, whether 1, 2, or 5, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 1 to 17. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh. And the issue of governance is crucial, and we've seen a failure of governance now with the pandemic at all levels, from the global to the local, it seems. And of course, India and every country have their own peculiarities, and we try to help. Thank you. There are also questions already, but let's go to our last discussant, Fay Leon, who through her work for the IISD Tracking Progress Program, formerly known as IISD Report and Services, Ms. Leone has witnessed and reported firsthand on major climate, environment, and sustainable development negotiations and conferences. Moreover, as an editor for the SDG Knowledge Hub, she has been following progress on SDG implementation around the world. So we look forward to hearing from her perspective. Comments. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yorios. I've really learned a lot already from the report and from all of you, especially about Karnataka. I wanted to step back for a moment to several years ago, very early on in the negotiations on the set of goals that's now known as the SDGs, where countries in South Asia were among those who held most tightly to the idea that it's not fair and it's not even logical to spend resources on environmental or social progress before economic growth. And then they linked this directly to fighting poverty. So from that starting point, it looks like a step forward that fighting poverty is now accepted as part of a 17-part holistic framework. And also the idea that choosing between fighting poverty and protecting the environment was always a false choice. But as the report emphasizes, and speakers today have been saying, that global commitment only matters at home if it's reflected in the governance structures, the budget decisions, and the assessment of progress. So I wanted to share a few things that we have heard are working for communities and countries around the world. I'll probably say about 1 minute on each one. So the first is gender equality as the formula, capital the, for accelerating the framework as a whole, the rest of the 2030 agenda. A colleague of mine recently wrote a policy brief on this. In case any of you know her, it's Nicole De Paula. The idea applies globally, that gender equality unlocks faster change on the rest. But every country is at a different starting point, of course. And Nicole's advice really seems relevant for India, that updating discriminatory laws, especially those governing access to and control over land, is a crucial building block. This was a global recommendation identified last year in the 25-year review of the Beijing Platform for Action on Women's Rights. And this is not as recent, but as of 2014, the OECD says that of 160 countries, only 59 allow women and men to have equal rights to own, use, and control land. So India is not alone on that issue. And then my next thought, another learning, is to take away some of the stigma on prioritizing among the goals and targets, sometimes called cherry picking. It turns out that we have to start somewhere, but I would identify two principles to guide how the goals are selected for starting with. So first, to keep the whole SDG framework in mind, as Nikhil said, to illuminate the entire pie. I love that way of looking at it. And to try to protect against negative effects on other goals. So to manage these potential trade-offs, a starting point is to build relationships between the relevant government departments that it may seem like they're working on contrasting issues. So have them work together. And then also with community organizations who are the experts on the immediate effects of the issues on people's lives. The second principle for prioritizing, one approach is to choose a target that would spark the most change in other targets so that you're getting more impact at once. So some researchers call these targets more networked targets, more central targets. They look at the level of interaction among targets. And the FOG's authors have already done this in an informal way as it applies to India and selecting those three goals to focus on. Daniel, I think, is going to help me with a slide to give a global view on interactions among all 17 goals. And I think it's nice to look at which one has, so I'll set this up a little bit. So the orange color shows trade-offs that would need to be addressed, and blue is the opposite, it's the co-benefit, so interactions that are positive. There's only one goal that's only blue, and it's hard to see, but it's goal 5. This is from the 2019 edition of the Global Sustainable Development Report, and I'm grateful to them for this simple depiction of this complicated issue. Thank you, Daniel. I think we can take it down. I'm happy to send the link to the report if that's useful. And you know, that's high level. There is some country-specific research, including for India. IGES has some data on country level interactions among targets, but it may even be for India an area for state level research. And there's also a lack of data at the target level, and that would make this prioritization more effective. So the idea is just to use this kind of analysis. So for India at the target level would need more data first, but to make sure that policies or budget allocations on a selected SDG target are pulling their weight, so to speak, in this heavily interlinked agenda. My third thought of learnings is on engaging communities in collecting data and even in choosing indicators. Using data from outside the national statistical system, you know, with apologies to the professional statisticians who many of them I know it's like they're on a life mission to create pure, reliable, comparable data, and understandably are concerned about bringing in other sources. So it could be a gradual process, perhaps a partnership building process, but allowing communities to help collect data builds trust in the data. It makes sure that things are being measured in a way that makes the invisible visible by selecting the indicators that actually matter to each community. And it could eventually help offset this acute data gap mentioned in the report. A best practice that we've seen, especially through our IISD's tracking progress work, which began in Winnipeg, Canada, and is spreading around the world, is the idea of a community platform where data are available to the community that it is about, Perhaps this is similar to the dashboards at state level that Dr. Tara mentioned. I'm not sure. Winnipeg's platform shows how a community's chosen indicators correspond to the SDGs. It doesn't replace them. So existing data sets don't have to be altered in order to be included in the platform, but then it will show if there's a gap for reporting on the SDGs. And another feature of the platform is that it creates maps at the neighborhood level to sort of visually show the difference, for example, in life expectancy from one location to another, even within a town. So it's helping data to tell its stories. Okay, number 4, how's my time? Okay, I'm gonna speed up. I wanted to talk about governance structure, but there are really so many ways to do it, and great experiments are already underway all around the world. I'm gonna skip my examples because I know everyone has their own examples, but many governments, just as a trend, are insisting on a whole of government approach. And the latest example, and a happy surprise for me, is the new US administration and how it's handling climate change domestically by having high-level leaders across all areas of government come up with a climate change plan that relates to their sector. This is new for us. And then finally, voluntary national reviews. So India's done 2. They jumped right in 2017 and then did one last year in that very difficult year. As they might look toward doing a 3rd, there is a lot of emerging trends on getting the most value out of the VNR process. It can help identify the longer term pathways, find areas where we may be backsliding, identify the difficult trade-offs, and exchange good practices on navigating them. It can even lead to focusing on a small set of targets with the most transformational potential. And some countries are sort of breaking new ground on engaging civil society, including to the extent of leaving space in their official report for a side-by-side assessment by civil society. Finland did this last year. So just a final thought, and this actually links back to John's comments at the beginning. I think it's a source of hope to hear that even in a powerful government like India, it's not immune to some positive peer pressure. And the trends in the VNR process in particular, if India were to take them up more going forward, that could spark further change and improvement, including stronger linkages with civil society, which, as we all agree, I think is the way to make changes last and to reach everyone. So I'll end there. Sorry for going a bit over. I'm happy to discuss more or to share links and sources and things. Thank you.
Thank you, Faye. Very, very helpful and different perspective. And the VNR also, of course, the process at the UN, the data and the stories they can tell, and all this. Thank you very much. We have completed all the presentations and we have answered already in the process some of the questions, but I would like to summarize the questions that remain in a way unanswered, and then ask whoever wants, and certainly the co-authors of the report, to say a few words before we conclude. So we have like 2 or 3 sets of questions. One is, of course, how the pandemic has impacted on SDG implementation, and how the SDGs 1, 2, and 5 that are covered by this report, but also the rest of the SDGs, can they be achieved by the end of the decade? Because that's the target, that's the 2030 agenda and vision of the UN. Of course, I would like to tell everybody that achieving the SDGs, it's not a moment we did it and we finished with it, because maintaining the SDGs afterwards, meaning from clean water to gender equality to good governance, is a continuous struggle which cannot finish in 2030 or at any point. But so this is one of the questions: how did COVID impact, and what we expect for the achievement of the SDGs by 2030? Another is about the Indian governance system and the planning that has changed. What also we heard before from Dr. Tandon about the planning structures not being used, and also in terms of corruption and fraud and lack of transparency and accountability. What could we say about that? It's the responsibility of the governments at the various levels. So what is the central government's responsibility, and what is the state governments, and also how do they interact with civil society and other stakeholders, do they really take into account? We heard from Faye that pressure shows some results, but is there organized interaction between governments and stakeholders of all kinds? And finally, what would be the next steps after the report to address in practice the issues that we have identified, and whether we will do it as a group with the authors, the discussants, or who should be doing what? Thank you. Who wants to take the floor?
Can I start from the last question? Yes, thank you very much. Thank you all for the amazing discussion. I just want to, I'm not going to answer the substantial questions that concern India, because I'm not an expert, and the rest of the co-authors are much more, can do that much better than me. But I think the question about what is next and what do we do after the report is a question that we were talking about even before writing the report, because we really didn't want to have this project as a project that ends up with a report. It was COVID that actually forced us to go back in a way to a more old-fashioned kind of project delivery, which was this report. Our initial idea was to do something much more practical. And I'm just going to reiterate here a discussion that we had with Neetu when she was in London, and we were planning. That was just a couple of weeks before the lockdown, so early March of 2020, just before everything went down. And together with Georgios and the others were joining online already back then, we were, what we wanted to do was to actually try to help in this idea of ownership and integrating SDGs in everyday business of public administration. So our initial idea was not to spend the very, very limited budget that we had in reports and events between ourselves in a way, but to try to run some kind of workshops, not training, because as you said, training is not always so successful, but workshops together with probably independent authorities, ombudsmen, trying to understand from their reports what they find related to these SDGs, that maybe they don't even call them SDGs, they're just gonna share with us their findings about children, about gender, and then try to, in a way, integrate SDGs in their everyday work, reporting, and recommendations for the state. So this was a very small idea, which I thought was a very inspiring idea, because it was much more about working together with the public administration and the independent authorities to gain this ownership. We didn't manage to travel to Bangalore, Georgios and myself, and to continue with this idea, and with Neetu and Sudha. Hopefully we can maybe try to do that in the future, or if you say to us that this idea was not good enough, we can hear from you what else can be done, and apply for extra funding. I mean, this was really, really small project. Yeah, we didn't have money to really do a lot on the ground. We would have done a pilot workshop of this kind in Bangalore or two, but not much more. So nothing else from me. Thank you all for your very, very nice points and ideas.
Stella, who comes next? Anybody else who would like to take the floor? We have about 7 minutes. If Sudha or John, something from what you heard, the feedback to the report, more specifically?
Well, maybe I can jump in and Sudha could perhaps follow. I mean, I don't thank very much the discussants, because I think they've added tremendous depth to a report that was basically a kind of seed project. If we only looked at 3 SDGs, as Nikal said, it would have been nice to look at all of them, but that would have required the time and budget. And I think we've noted the kind of comments that were made then, particularly linking health and education to the 3 examples that we did look at. But I think the key idea that's appeared, and one of the questions that just came up, I mean, not only what do we do next, but the relationship between government and other structures, is in fact exactly this point, that really we tend to think about the SDGs often, I think, of it as a top-down kind of model. It's something governments do, government agencies do, or states in a country like India do. But in fact, it should really be a bottom-up thing. It should be a democratized process It should be one that is I think one of the commentators said, the ownership of these goals is important. Not only in kind of just sort of in moral terms, but I think because in my own experience, this enormously increases the effectiveness of processes like this. And I think, one of the perhaps general lessons from an awful lot of development studies is that the top-down never works as well as something which is initiated from the very communities that are going to be responsible for it and are going to live with the consequences of whatever policy is occurring. Imposed on them, they probably don't want it, but if they grow it themselves, it will become an organic part of that community. And I think that that's a key point, in fact, to think about in terms of, how to carry analysis of the SDGs forward from here. But that's a few thoughts. Sudha, you may have something to add to that.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Thank you all the discussants. And it's very, very important, and we really got very good feedback, which we would definitely, utilize of it. In fact, in our next, in the process. Certainly, yes, this importance. I'm sorry if I'm repeating again. Importance of 1 to 5, which Rajesh sir said. That's also Nikhil sir also mentioned that importance of 1 to 5 is so crucial for a sustainable development. Of course, we have to bring in the climate also, the SDG and the climate also. That's also is a very related one. And of course, due to this time limit and other financial constraints, and also what happened, we planned to have a very evidence-based research in this. Since I have been very much connected with the grassroots, I was really looking at how to bring these ground realities to the research. Unfortunately, of course, with the COVID lockdown, we could not do, but still we were able to add something of that. Yes, as Tara ma'am said, mainly focused on hunger, and malnutrition, where we did a kind of we had a rapid assessment about the impact of COVID on these on the communities, which I was very much involved along with Neetu. So we have brought that into the report, what exactly happened during soon after the lockdown. And so I do agree with Rajesh sir, what he said is how should be a resilient community work on this. It's very, very important. It's obviously, as John also said, it's kind of, it's a bottom-up approach. Bottom up, of course, we have been repeating, it is not just for SDGs. It has been there for any type of, we really need to have not just good governance, but also responsive governance. It has to be from bottom up. It's not just the trickle down approach, which never works. And we have seen globally also, it's not just Indian aspect. So how to bring into the really, it's not just, using some policy theories and all that, but how to bring in from the people themselves, how to bring that ownership of the people there. In fact, I have been involved in the training at the local panchayat level, elected members, communities, women, and when I talked about SDGs during our, elected representatives trainings, sorry to say that nobody is aware of these things. Of course, there are manuals. In fact, government has developed the manuals for the elected representatives. It's there. But people are not aware of it. For that matter, even including some of the acts, some of the policies, how come they're getting their rights in the PDS system? They don't know this is their right. And it is just the people think it's still a charity by the government, giving the rice or whatever things they're getting on a subsidies or whatever, whether it's a free rice or a subsidy rice. So to that extent, I know still people are ignorant of, I'm sorry, I don't want to say ignorance, it is we created the ignorance there. And we really, even the SDGs also should go on the right-based approach, rather than just mere welfare, or it goes, people, when you say welfare schemes or welfare approach, in fact, people understand it's a charity approach. In fact, they think it's a charity. They don't take it's their rights, their entitlements, and they have the legal entitlement to act on, to, to question anything. No, it is not really happening most of the time. I'm saying there are, of course, wherever the NGOs are involved, they're educating, creating awareness, but it's a big challenge. I mean, though I see such a developed state like Karnataka, but still, since I have some experience at the national level and also internationally in some other communities in other countries also, I see that people are still at the bottom level, people are still hesitate to question anything, ask for their rights, even in Latin America, even in Brazil, even, this is my experience when I work at the grassroots at anywhere in the, my experience. So definitely, thank you so much, all the discussions. And now the challenge is the COVID. And this second wave COVID has completely, brought us completely down. I don't know whether we need to restructure SDG framework, because globally also there's an impact, whether we need to restructure the national indicators framework, whether we need to restructure the SDG framework itself. I'm not sure, because I was wondering about this. Looking at Indian, just recently on 5th May, Ajim Premji University brought out a report. It looks like 230 Indians have fallen into the below poverty line. 230 million Indians have come down to below poverty line. I mean, that means, and again coming to the gender aspect, look at that, there are more men. I mean, the men were almost 7% of the men have come down to the informal workforce. But imagine the women are out of workforce. So that's the difference. That is the disparity, between men and women. Of course, again, I'm insisting on that we need to bring in the sexual minorities also into this, how they are struggling. And as social aspects of the caste, gender, religion, now this is another thing. There are huge disparities are actually being created. Something are historically, sociologically, anthropologically is there, but there are some created things also there. So how to balance, how to work on this is a big, very big challenge. And so I think that whether, I don't know, I'm a small person for this, whether to restructure and relook into this national indicators framework in the context of this COVID. And we are expecting third wave. I don't know, second wave itself, we are
world may be operating in a way, the whole world may be operating in a crisis mode for years to come. And then we may have to rethink a lot of the frameworks. Just to promote a bit an idea that we have here at Fox is to have a global resilience council, to think of resilience as a paramount good that we have to ensure for everybody, because what we said before, like development, etc., were a bit too optimistic and destroyed the planet in the process. But now we may have to think more of resilience and dealing with emergencies one after the other.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, resilience. One is the, of course, it's not just health, because now people are talking about health alone, because it's not the collapse of the health system, it is the exposure of the collapse system. I can say that. And then it's what about others? Like, I was discussing with Tara ma'am about this, increased child marriages, increased child labor, increased women, the violence against women. All these things also had to reproductive rights. All these things are related here. It is not just health alone. So this is the kind of isolated, the way our approach is not going to help in a long term. We really need to relook and restructure, recontextualize the whole, indicators, our system of working and the governance. Okay, sorry, I go on with this because I'm going through this pain and I'm seeing the communities suffering. That's why I'm saying it. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Anybody else? I mean, this is a lot of food for thought and a lot of things we want to do and to bring stakeholders together. And Stella said, and John and everybody of you, with all the experience that we have, it's happened in many countries also. We can exchange visits and bring people together. The human contact, I hope we can have it again, or even online, to bring this bottom up and at the same time, big framework approach. This is the global approach, from the global to the local and back. We need to work at all levels, I think. No? Thank you very much. I think we've reached the end of it, unless you have something very pressing to say. Yes, Dr. Tara wants to say a word. Yes. Could you unmute yourself, please?
Just want to add to this, because from the SDGs, lens, I think the best practices, even in India, there are plenty that needs to be captured. Small, however small they may be. But, just to give you an example, of course, it was in my PPT, but since I didn't have time, I just could not share it with you. Having some kind of establishing a help desk and a single window system that was tried out in one ward, urban ward, okay, which was created exclusively to bring all the what should I say, the marginalized community. Okay, so the effort has been so good. It captures goal 1, 2, 5. The CIFAR is one organization which is trying to mobilize and enable all the services that they should get. From the entitlement point of view, they've been a successful thing. And in fact, looking at that experience, the government wants to expand it to the other districts. But what I'm saying is, it will be good if you're able to capture that, that evidence from, from that help, from that single window, the concept that they have, and the center itself. Talk to a few women, who are marginalized and who have been able to successfully get all their entitlements, and yet been able to bring others to get what they should be getting it. I think that's something very good, and they're very vocal about it in terms of how they should take it forward. So some of the best practices, no matter how small they are, I think that needs to be brought out, because here it's also a partnership between the government and the CBOs, at the grassroots level. So I think it's a wonderful experience. One should have an opportunity to visit them and capture those things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, we can only if we work together, we can manage to achieve what we hope to achieve for everybody: well-being, resilience, sustainability. And they are not only words, they are real life issues. So thank you very much. Many thanks, especially to our discussants who joined us for this. Many thanks, and all the wisdom that they shared. Many thanks to my fellow co-authors of the report. Thank you also to my colleagues at Fox who organized this, Daniel Orth, Manan Shah, and our social media team, Dasha, Sumilova, and Marwa Ziara. Thank you all for listening, and we hope we'll have it available also online as a recorded discussion for you to be able to access in a few hours' time. And the discussion continues and the action continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.